If you're anything like I am, then you likely knew little to nothing about the wildly popular autumn Starbucks beverage called pumpkin spice latte. Until but a few months ago, I'd never heard of it in my entire life, despite it having existed for more than 10 years. In my defense, I virtually never go to Starbucks, so I have good reason for my former ignorance. However, pumpkin spice latte has been quote-unquote trending, to use Newspeak, for quite some time, and eventually I caught wind of it. The interest in making this video came about at least partially from an article making fun of a silly feminist who had herself made a post claiming that making fun of pumpkin spice latte consumption and discussion was sexist towards women. An excerpt from the counter-article reads as follows. Quote, according to a Swarthmore student's op-ed, the real reason that people make fun of pumpkin spice lattes is that our society thinks everything girls like is stupid because, quote, girls don't get to have valid emotions, end quote. It all comes back to sexism, Min Cheng writes in a piece for The Phoenix, Swarthmore's official student newspaper. People love to hate on what girls like. The PSL hate seems to be a symptom of a larger problem. Girls don't get to have valid emotions, she continues, end quote. The counter-article's author then goes on to point out that activities and things men enjoy doing are also joked about and made fun of. All in all, it's a rather unremarkable, bland, and standard anti-feminist style riot post along the lines of feminists are stupid and say stupid things. And if I were an anti-feminist myself, I would leave it at that. But I want to delve deeper into the phenomenon of social trends, and indeed coffee drinking trends in this case. I thought to myself, there must be more to this than mere feminist claptrap and anti-feminist counters to this. After all, the superficially spoken often reveals something more of our unconscious motives. What the feminist author had at least implied with her article was that consumption of pumpkin spice latte was greater among women than men, and so I began to dig deeper. To clarify, this video is not really about pumpkin spice latte per se. To the extent that it is, pumpkin spice latte is only representative of something bigger, a larger and more general phenomenon. What I seek to ascertain is how and why women use social media and to what end, what trends actually mean in terms of adaptive evolutionary behavior, and how in this case pumpkin spice latte, which is merely representative of larger phenomena, is related to it all. But before I begin offering hypotheses, let us first review some relevant data before proceeding further. It's a relatively safe assumption to make that women tend to be more active on social media, but it is important to go into the specifics, such as what we can find from an article with reference to data compiled on sex-specific internet usage. Quote, the old saying, men are from Mars and women are from Venus holds water when it comes to how men and women use social media. Females use social media less than men for business reasons, whereas women use social media to share more personal information than me, revealing more about their personal lives. Women are more vocal, expressive, and willing to share. In other words, women are biologically wired for social networking. At least, that's according to data compiled by FinancesOnline.com. Sounds cliche, doesn't it? Generally, females use social networking sites to make connections and stay in touch with family and friends. Men, by contrast, use social media to gather information they need to build influence. Social media helps them perform research, gather relevant contacts, and ultimately increase their status, end quote. Now, none of this should surprise us if we spend any time learning about the different reproductive priorities men and women have, and that such priorities have universal effects on all manner of things, from choice of profession, how one interacts with other people, the things that interest the person, and so on and so forth. And of course, there is the ubiquitous brain research out there, which in posting I feel is becoming somewhat repetitive, but for the sake of completeness and reference, it serves its purpose. Scientists have drawn on nearly 1,000 brain scans to confirm what many had surely concluded long ago, that stark differences exist in the wiring of male and female brains. Maps of neural circuitry showed that on average, women's brains were highly connected across the left and right hemispheres, in contrast to men's brains where the connections were typically stronger between the front and back regions. Regina Verma, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, said the greatest surprise was how much the findings supported old stereotypes, with men's brains apparently wired more for perception and coordinated actions, and women's for social skills and memory, making them better equipped for multitasking. Well, this is nothing new, but it does help to flesh out the differences between men and women before elaborating further and making my case. Now we come directly to social media, and the differences between the sexes in terms of social media and application. On the whole, women do use social media slightly more often, but the really interesting aspects are those of how the genders break down in terms of which platforms they use, as explained below. Men and women have varying degrees of online activity across different sites. 74% of internet users are using social media, with women 76% having a slight edge over men 72%. According to the research compiled by several sources cited by the article, the breakdown is as follows. Men are 72% of internet users, and women are 76% of internet users. 54% of men stay in touch with friends via social media, and 69% of women do the same. A stark difference between mobile internet use of only 39% internet users being male using the internet via mobile versus a much larger number of 69% of internet users being female. 66% of internet users use Facebook and are male, and 76%, namely all of the documented female internet users, use it. Women have 55% more posts on their Facebook wall than men. 15% of internet users who use Twitter are male, and 22% of internet users that use Twitter are female. 8% of internet users that use Pinterest are male versus 33% that are female. 24% of internet users use LinkedIn and are male versus 19% female, etc. There are more statistics, and you can look at them by checking out the links, but let's just continue for the time being. Men are more active on LinkedIn, Google+, and YouTube, whilst women are more active on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. This should not surprise us, as the breakdown seems to follow natural differences among the sexes. LinkedIn is a professional site related to job and career. Neither Google+ nor YouTube lend themselves well to instant communication and tend to be more about sharing ideas via links rather than displaying things or repeating statements people make. Conversely, all the internet platforms women are more active on do lend themselves better to instant sharing and tend to be more about displays of things, usually in the form of pictures, mentions of activities users are engaging in, types of clothing they are wearing, food they are eating, etc. So whilst the total number of internet users in terms of percentages is pretty close between men and women, the actual breakdown of those users does show distinctive directions that the sexes tend to go in, and the directions do tend to break down along stereotypical ideas about the sexes. It's all well and good to list a bunch of things that conform to certain stereotypes or even make after-the-fact observations, but without trying to understand the ultimate causes of things, we're left in the dark, and without an explanation of human motive. As an aside, imagine if when comparing two breeds of dogs, the Greyhound and the Labrador Retriever, one were to only say, Greyhounds are faster than Labradors, and left it at that. Perhaps you've even observed in running about the park that the Greyhound is faster than the Labrador. You will not have learnt, however, why or how. Yet if you were to do some research on Greyhound anatomy, you would learn the reason. You would learn that they were bred for specific morphological features that enhance speed, such as very long legs, a flexible spine, small waist, yet remaining muscular, with a deep chest and a heart-to-body ratio of 1.18 to 1.73% of its body weight, whereas most other breeds' heart is about 0.77% of their total body weight. This would tell you that virtually all the anatomical features of the Greyhound are such that the breed is built for speed, specifically sprinting. But when you look at the Labrador, you would see the great anatomical differences and conclude that this breed, lacking such features as the Greyhound, will naturally not be as fast. You would have a mechanical explanation on what makes the Greyhound so fast compared to more conventionally built breeds. This illustrates why we need to observe phenomena and go beyond the observation. We need to attempt to understand the causes of phenomena, and this applies as much to the mechanics of Greyhound sprinting as it does to the human female and the human male. As we have established the tendencies of male and female netizens, we can now return to the phenomenon of the pumpkin spice latte. This drink is apparently one of the most iconic products offered by Starbucks, so much so that great debate rages on the internet concerning it, its ingredients, and its place on social media. A few months ago, a so-called food blogger, uncreatively called the Food Babe, created a post about the ingredients of pumpkin spice latte, which has subsequently led to a 70% increase in online discussion of the drink, which later led to a change in the ingredients of the drink. All well and good, but not particularly interesting if you do not consume pumpkin spice latte. However, in the article featuring this news, the following is also revealed. The PSL item has been much more of a Facebook phenomenon than a Twitter story. From October 3rd to 7th, the story received 1,421 public Facebook mentions and another 285 direct mentions on Twitter. We can also see that nearly twice as many women were mentioning the drink than men. Specifically, 64% female mentions versus 36% male mentions, which is backed up by the data cited earlier about the female activity in posting on Facebook versus male. And now we're coming closer to the meat of the matter. I seek to answer the question, among others, as to why an unremarkable caffeinated beverage would receive so much attention, and furthermore, what is it that drives women to pursue these types of trends, be it food, clothing, or what have you, and regard them as exceedingly important? We all have female acquaintances on Facebook who never cease in posting pictures of food they had at some upscale restaurant, usually some outrageously expensive yet diminutive dessert likely paid for by their boyfriend or husband, or some dress they might have purchased, whereas this sort of activity is much rarer among males. What is it about female nature that drives them to act differently with regard to fashion articles or food items, such that they must blog, share, and post incessantly about them? The question can be answered. But first, we need to discuss something I believe is directly related and key to understanding this. One of the fundamental psychological differences between men and women is the degree to which each sex is willing to undertake a risky behavior, where men tend to display a greater willingness to undertake a risk compared to women. Female risk aversion has been observed across many different areas, from their general unwillingness to engage in dangerous and dirty jobs, such as work on oil rigs, deep-sea fishing, and mining, to economic behavior, such as in the following quote. Quote, one of the findings of the recent BlackRock Investor Pulse survey of 4,000 Americans, for instance, is that women are generally more risk-averse than men when it comes to savings and investing. While greater risk aversion can help investors avoid unnecessary risks and losses from short-term gambling in the stock markets, women who concentrate their investments in lower-risk assets, such as cash and fixed-income securities, while shunning the riskier equity markets, risk falling short of their retirement and other long-term financial goals and projects, end quote. And greater risk aversion in women also seems to extend to the cognitive realm with regards to religiosity, as Professor Kanazawa explains. Quote, women in virtually every society and culture are more religious than men, and the empirical evidence suggests that the reason is not gender socialization. So what explains the higher level of religiosity among women? The sex difference in religiosity follows directly from the evolutionary psychological theory of the origin of religious beliefs that I present in earlier posts, Part 1, Part 2, and the sex difference in risk-taking, which I also explained in earlier posts, Part 1, 2, 3, and 4. You'll recall that the evolutionary origins of religiosity are in risk management. It is less risky to over-infer agency and hence be susceptible to religious beliefs than to under-infer agency and get killed by enemies and predators when you least expect them. It is an error management strategy to minimize the total cost of errors by predisposing the human brain to commit more false positive errors of inference than false negative errors, when the former has less costly consequences than the latter. So across the board, from physical activity to economic to religious, women tend to be more risk-averse than men. And returning to the phenomenon of social media and trends, the picture begins to open up as to what is likely transpiring. If there were perhaps any defining trait of human female behavior, such that it could be characterized as a modus operandi, it would be that risk aversion dictates much, if not most, of female behavior. We see it in voting, we see it in many different areas. What I'm proposing is that just as there is documented physical and cognitive risk aversion and risk mitigation, such as the aforementioned application of error management as a strategy in terms of cognitive and religious risk mitigation, there too exist modern tools of social risk mitigation that take on forms of social media expression. I believe that social risk is as important a factor to women as any other form of risk, perhaps even more so in our era than ever before, and that social media platforms, such as Twitter and Facebook, act as tools of risk mitigation within a social context that yield quick results due to the instantaneous nature of the internet. But it's not just about risk mitigation. as the phrase risk mitigation entails that there is something that should be risked in the first place, along the lines of nothing ventured, nothing gained. And here we come to the other part of the equation. Women are interested in status, where status usually correlates to resources. After observing and thinking about online female behavior with regards to trends in social media, I realize that there is probably a complex interplay between the two important concerns women tend to have, safety and status, even if in the case of the former that safety is intangible and merely a social perception. It's important to note before I proceed further that almost all of these phenomena I'm describing occur at a distal, ultimate level. Women tweeting about pumpkin spice latte are not thinking to themselves, my evolved behavior is making me tweet about pumpkin spice latte to mitigate the social risk in participating in its consumption. Put another way, the things I seek to describe here occur on a subconscious level, as so much of human behavior does. What I propose is that trends in evolutionary terms are symbols of status, and the social media exchange women engage in with respects to fashion and trends is reflective of something I would call social vetting, or testing the approval of others as a means of social risk assessment and an attempt to mitigate social risk. Consider the idea of clothing articles that are either quote-unquote in or quote-unquote out of style, or notions of things that are quote trending. In corresponds to that which has been socially vetted and whose risk has been assessed such that it is felt that it is safe for women to participate in what is in or trending. That is to say, these articles of clothing, these drinks, these things are okay to wear and drink. And a statement made by the renowned fashion designer Miuccia Prada supports this. Quote, fashion is the first step out of poverty. You have nothing, and then you put something on. It is one of the first things you do to elevate yourself. Why are people scandalized by spending money on clothes? Everybody is so passionate about this. There's a resistance to fashion, an idea that to love fashion is to be stupid. Clothes are very intimate. When you get dressed, you are making public your idea about yourself, and I think that embarrasses people, end quote. The very first sentence is strikingly honest and perceptive and demonstrates what fashion truly is about. Fashion is, quote, the first step out of poverty, which implies, and rightly so, that in previous times fashion was the province of those who could afford it. We all know that an essential part of female reproductive behavior is hypergamy, and fashion is reflective of this, inasmuch as fashion demonstrates both money and resources. It is a display of how high one stands correlating to the price tag attached to the garments. But in today's age, where most people in industrialized society can afford clothing, things are taken to another level. If fashion in and of itself is the first step out of poverty, then fashion trends are the measure of the step itself, which is why so many women pursue trends and not just those related to clothing. Wearing the quote-unquote right clothes is commensurate with status, and women are instinctively obsessed with status. The delineation of in and out is a declaration of demarcation of where lines of approved status begin and end. In the past, we've talked about female in-group preference, but have not gone into detail as to its basis and function. In this context, I believe it becomes at least partially clear. A collective mindset whereby the primary criterion is simply a shared gender can do enormous work in terms of social risk assessment and mitigation, where women partner up in agreement in order to defend their status interests, such as those of fashion, or as has been mentioned at the beginning of the video, a popular beverage, such as pumpkin spice latte. If the primary and main criterion is merely the shared sex of being a woman, then this allows the social vetting process to proceed far more quickly than it otherwise would were other criteria present that could hinder quick expedition. And I would argue it is an important reason why women display in-group preference, namely, for the sake of fast expedition of shared goals, be they in terms of getting legislation passed or diminishing risk in social settings. The adaptive value of in-group preference is that it bypasses the actual content of the thing being agreed upon, beyond a superficial level at least. In-group preference also creates a united front where other women, to the extent they may not agree, feel peer pressure to join in and participate, lest they be left out and suffer demotion in status. In saying this, we can now return to the representative item of pumpkin spice latte. With one instance of a feminist claiming that poking fun of it is tantamount to criticizing women in general, and the somewhat more subtle topic of the October discussion of the drink, which largely centered around the caramel coloring Starbucks had been using, where the food blogger, Twitter, and Facebook campaigned to have it removed, something that was later met with success, but could only have been facilitated by the quick agreement of large numbers of other women, many more women than men, and this can effectively be broken down as follows. An ingredient is thought to be harmful by one woman, which is then shared via social networking, and it begins to quote-unquote trend for a few days, raising the concerns of other women about the drink's content. Now, whether the caramel coloring is actually dangerous or not is by and large irrelevant, and as an aside, I honestly don't know. What is important in the eyes of women is the perception of danger, the perception of risk, not the legitimately qualified presence of it, which is the mover and driver of so much of female concern. Recall the pic posting and tweeting campaign had been composed of twice as many women as men. Before I move on to a closely related topic, I wish to emphasize something I've talked about in the past. We are all the end products of an evolved psychology that developed over the course of a time scale we can scarcely imagine. And given the weight of its presence, it is almost certain that this evolved psychology continues to interact with the environment today. But given unforeseen technological developments such as the internet and social media, it can seem difficult to understand. But new environments merely create alternative pathways for a relatively fixed human nature to express itself, and this, I should hope, has been illustrated by the previous discussion, both in terms of numbers and details. Moving on to the final leg of the video, I would now like to explore how the aforementioned behavioral mechanisms interact with the world of comic books and tabletop RPGs for the purposes of further documentation. I maintain that the observed social vetting and risk mitigation are in operation here as well, in addition to some other important factors. Let us begin with a quote taken from a site called the Mary Sue, documenting the rapid growth of female attendance of the New York Comic Con. Quote, using some sales kits from Reed Pop, the 2013 figures, as can be found here, comic book journalist, the former TMS weekend editor Janelle Aslin crunched some numbers on her Tumblr page and got this. Men in 2010, 65% of 96,000 total equals 62,400 men, and in 2013, 59% of 133,000 total equals 78,470 men. 16,070 more men in 3 years, 26% growth rate. Women, 2010, 35% of 96,000 total equals 33,600 women. 2013, 41% of 133,000 total equals 54,530 women. 20,930 more women in 3 years. 62% growth rate. While men still outnumber women as New York City Comic Con attendees, women as attendees are a demo that is growing way faster, Aslin remarks. Take notes, comics people. She adds, not that New York City is the only place where women are attending comic book conventions more frequently, it actually appears to be a growing trend. There's that word again, especially at the largest conventions. In 2012, Director of Marketing for Comic-Con International David Glanza told Forbes that of the 130,000 Comic-Con attendees that year, about 40% were women. At Emerald City Comic-Con this year, and that's in Seattle, my side note, female attendees were actually in the majority, clocking in at 52% female, with 46% male, with 2% identifying as neither gender. To get a perspective on how different things used to be many years ago, at least in terms of size and scale, we can listen to a man named Darren Tompkins who had attended his first comic convention in the mid-'80s. Quote, really, it was just a small ballroom filled with cardboard boxes, Tompkins says. I mean, there weren't any actors or famous people or panels or anything. It was just a place for comic book dealers to get together and sell their wares. Of course, Tompkins does not speak of gender numbers or anything of the sort, but we do get an idea of the size and scope of what comic conventions used to be like in the 30 or so years ago he attended. Small, unremarkable places for devoted comic aficionados and comic dealers, not the blockbuster massive events they have become today. Moreover, It should be obvious to anyone that the surprise and observation of growing female participation would necessarily have to be contrasted by a lack of female attendance in past years. Otherwise, it would not be remarked on as being something notable. And it's also mentioned on Mary Sue that men still make up the larger number of attendees. So the real question to be answered is, why is there female growth attendance in the first place? Did women in recent years rather suddenly develop an interest in comic books and comic content? Or is there something else operative here? Unfortunately, it's impossible to get solid numbers on female comic book participation over the last 3 decades, either in terms of purchases or attendance. But there are other means of gauging the degree of female interest in the comic book genre. There is an excellent comic book channel called Comics Explained, which I highly recommend, and the link is in the low bar, and he has well over 400,000 subscribers. In my view, he has one of the best comic book channels on YouTube, where he offers concise, well-explained details on DC and Marvel comics, and unfortunately, I cannot parse the gender demographics of his channel via his analytics. However, I can observe, and have observed over the course of dozens and dozens of videos of his that I've watched, that there is close to zero female commentary. I've seen 1 or 2 female comments in dozens and dozens of videos. That's my addendum. A quick glance at some other major comic channels, such as Comic Historian, tends to reveal the same thing: little to zero female commentary. Now, one could weakly argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but women have few qualms about commenting on so-called lifestyle vlogs and ASMR videos, so the most likely conclusion is that these large comic channels have an incredibly small female demographic of subscribers, and one that is proportionally far smaller than what we can see in the gender demographics of Comic-Con participation. This, on its face, appears to make little sense, since surely greater female participation in some of the largest comic conventions in the world would be matched by greater female interest and participation in comic culture in general, specifically on some of the largest comic YouTube channels that exist. The answer to this question is fairly complex, and I do believe there are a number of factors at play, so let's proceed by going through them all. Large-scale conventions are well known and widely publicized, with this lending itself to being appropriately vetted socially. And furthermore, the amount of money and publicity poured into such events is another point of attraction. Comic culture's public exposure on a large scale at Comic-Con creates the incentive for female participation because of the correlating status associated with participation, along with the visible aspects of it. Just as women share pictures on social media of themselves and their activities, so too does this contribute to a greater motivation to attend such an event where one can receive visual exposure and share the exposure with others. If we contrast this with earlier times, such as the 1980s, comic conventions had neither the publicity, which can equate to having been successfully socially assessed and vetted as low risk, but carrying high reward, nor the money to allow for publicity. In short, it was a low-status, so-called nerd activity. The other major factor, which should shock no one, is that most women are simply not interested in comic content, which partially explains the seemingly high participation levels at comic events, which are mostly about show and tell, but low to non-existent participation levels on comic channels, where there is no large-scale gathering and little to no publicity. In other words, nothing to show and tell. Subscribers to these channels, such as myself, typically are interested in learning the details of storylines, the development history of certain characters, such as Darkseid, and the powers and abilities of superheroes and supervillains. Beyond this, there is little in the way of public exposure, and I would argue that the same psychological forces that keep women away from such channels are the same ones that kept them away from such events in past decades. A lack of wide-scale public exposure, a lack of money being poured into the venue, and finally, a genuine lack of interest in the content. But the last aspect does require some further exploration, namely, what aspects of comic content make the culture more appealing to men than women? One already mentioned is the level of detail. Even if fictive and invented, is quite overwhelming and technical. Powers and abilities, intricate storylines, and such, as understanding the Green Lantern's power battery and how it works, or the interaction between Wolverine's healing factor and his toxic adamantium skeletal lacing. These are not things that typically fascinate women. Moreover, The hero, as an icon of someone who overcomes great adversity through struggle, is something that is far more appealing and indeed accessible to males as opposed to females. I spent a great portion of this video delving into the multiple levels of female risk aversion, be they physical, social, or even cognitive, and even outlined a plausible mechanism for mitigating social risk via social media. Given this aspect of human female nature, would a focus on facing an adversity and risk head-on and overcoming them at possible great cost to oneself be of interest to most women? I think not. Based on the observable data, I would argue that most female interest in comic book culture is artificial, and to the extent that it is present, is born of the relatively recent popularity and money involved, not in the core aspects of what makes comic book culture and comic books interesting, to most men at least. But I'm not yet finished, as there remains one last cultural hotspot we can explore as it relates to the topic at hand, namely tabletop RPGs. For those of you who are unfamiliar, tabletop RPGs are role-playing games involving dice, creative fiction, and large sets of rules, usually played out at a person's home in the company of several people with a dungeon or game master leading a campaign and other people being interactive players. The most famous example of this would be Dungeons & Dragons, but there are many others, such as Warhammer and White Wolf Studio Games. Unfortunately, in spite of my efforts, there exists no hard data on tabletop RPG participation akin to what we have in regards to Comic-Con participation. However, this has not stopped some from attempting to compile such data. One man from a site called Geeks and Sundry, who has RPGing since 1979, had the following to say, quote, "I've been involved with RPGs on and off since 1979. I do not recall anyone in any of these groups I gamed with starting or behaving in any obvious way that indicated to me that we did not want female participants in the group. That being said, the observed ratio has continued to be around 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 male to female over the past 34 years. Sometimes I managed to get a group with 2 to 3 female gamers, but that has been extremely rare. And usually there was only a female member because she was the girlfriend or wife of one of the male gamers. Currently I am running 3 groups, one online with 1 female player and 4 male, another at home with the same female player and 5 male, and a third at the RPG Research Office as the preliminary observation group that has 0 female players. During the search for participants for the third group, only 1 woman applied, while nearly 20 men applied. She was in the end unable to participate due to scheduling issues. I've always been puzzled by this ongoing imbalance. In discussions, people have claimed RPGs just aren't interesting to women because it's not the kind of activity they enjoy. This sounds like ongoing stereotyping to me. Most of the female gamers I've spoken with enjoy RPGs just as much as any of the male gamers. I will make the following statement with hesitancy due to the risk of stereotyping. The main difference the female gamers did point out, however, was that they preferred campaigns, the world and setting style of RPG that involved a lot more social dynamics and ROLE, role-playing. Detailed character backgrounds, complex social interactions between player characters and non-player characters, etc. over ROLL, role-playing, statistical number crunching, hack-and-slash combat, divvying up loot, etc. I generally prefer the role aspect over ROL role myself, and run games with the role-playing emphasis. His commentary is quite revealing, and the 4-to-1 ratio was buttressed by others in the comment section. Any group that I've been a part of that had 1 or more female players in it, the 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 male or female ratio seems to stand in my experience, the females seem to feel comfortable in the group and be well received by the males in the group, so again, in my experience, there doesn't seem to be any active enmity towards females participating in the games, just a lack of females showing interest in participating." End quote. One of the main distinctions, and I believe he is correct, the original poster made, was of the difference between role-playing, ROLE, playing, versus role-playing, ROLL, playing. Essentially acting out a character and rolling dice and getting into the mechanics. I'd played Dungeons & Dragons for a long time, and I was always more interested in the technical dice combat magic aspects than I was in the playing of the character. Character playing was important too, but I was more interested in leveling up and becoming a competent and powerful fighter, thief, or mage. And despite the fears of the author of the post engaging in gender stereotyping, what he says does seem to hold water. I also find the ratios of male to female participation interesting because they mirror to a large degree the same levels of participation in technical fields such as engineering. Quote, women increased their representation at the bachelor's degree level for the fourth straight year, earning 18.9% of degrees awarded in 2012, up from 17.8% in 2009. Women's enrollment in bachelor's degrees programs also increased slightly over the past few years, from 18.1% in 2010 to 18.9% in 2012. Based on enrollment trends, we expect to see the percentage of women receiving an engineering bachelor's degree to increase slightly over the next few years. The percentage of engineering master's degrees going to women reached a 10-year high of 23.1. Over the past decade, however, that percentage has been relatively stable, dipping only to a low of 21.9 in 2004. The percentage of doctoral degrees awarded to women rose slightly over 2011 to 22.2, and represents an increase of almost 5% since 2003. Based on enrollment trends, we expect the percent of doctoral degrees awarded to women to remain about the same over the next few years. Taken from the publication Engineering by the Numbers, the statistics cited seem to roughly correlate to the 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratio cited for female participation in tabletop RPGs, with the tendency going more to the 20%, and I do believe there is a link. There will always be aspects of characterization in tabletop RPGing, but along with that will inevitably come many technical aspects depending on the game, despite various attempts to streamline games such as D&D in recent years. Games such as Warhammer and others remain fairly technical, and there is as much rolling of the dice as there is character impersonation. In addition, in a game such as Warhammer, there are other elements that can be likened to, say, geopolitical struggle that are typically not of interest to women. Women, generally speaking, as evidenced by their professional choices, appear to be little interested in the more technical aspects of things, be it academic engineering or tabletop RPGs. There is one final element to consider as well when it comes to female participation in tabletop RPGs, which is the perception of status. You will recall that the perception of status is as important as the actual status of a thing or activity. Tabletop RPGs still to this day carry the stigma of alleged geekiness, and it is an image, unlike with comics and video games, that has been difficult to cast off, and they also do not get the same levels of exposure or financial support as the now more mainstream genres of comics and video games do. Put another way, tabletop RPGs have not been socially vetted, and have been found wanting in that they have not passed the social safety net test and thus represent social risk, which then combined with a general lack of interest on the part of the female population results in a continually skewed ratio of gender participation. Contrast this with the growing numbers of women involved in the comic book scene, at least at public venues, and you can see where this is going. The purpose of this video was to hypothesize and explain the mechanisms of motivation behind evolved female behavior in the use of social media, as well as link these mechanisms to different entertainment genres to see to what extent they are operative. As far as social and perceived risk mitigation is concerned, there appear to be two primary means of achieving this for women. One is a more active role, such as seen in support of the drink pumpkin spice latte and the food bloggers' campaign to have an ingredient removed by marshalling large numbers of other women to agree by tapping into their own fear of risk and possible harm, and this can be successful even if the perceived threat or risk is non-existent. We can recall women operate similarly in the political sphere, and the in-group bias is bolstered by common concerns for safety and security. But the internet, by way of social media, offers a near instantaneous means of mobilization of female group interest. The other means of social vetting is far more passive. If a genre or venue has achieved sufficient public exposure and has had enough money thrown at it, then it can be regarded as socially acceptable for the purposes of participation, which is what we see in the case of the contrast between Comic-Con and tabletop RPGs. And yet it also seems very likely that the interest generated here is born largely of the status attached to the event, since female participation in actual comic book discussion remains very low on forums and comic book related channels. This, for the time being, is a working hypothesis, and I do believe the observable data match the conclusions drawn from those data. But I am under no illusion that a feminist or even anti-feminist would take any of this into account, and in that respect, I find myself repeating myself yet again. Without understanding why we do things, why women do the things they do, and why men do the things they do, any semblance of a solution to the problems we face shall forever remain a pipe dream, and they may well be insolvable regardless. But we can throw more certainty onto the fire of futility if we ignore basic facts and knowledge of evolved human behavior. Feminists can be expected to ignore such things, but I have to add that anti-feminists do themselves, as well as their criticism of feminists, a huge disservice by not drawing upon the wealth of knowledge available today. Thanks for watching, and as always, links are in the low bar. Check you out later.